Good evening, everyone, and greetings across the globe to our listeners, viewers, and fellow citizens. I welcome you all to our special weekly program where we discuss one of the key subject matters or the topics which impacts a large section of population across the globe with one of our leading expert, specialist, or pioneer in the respective subject matter. Today, we have our special guest, that is Professor Eleanor Mary Brown. Today's discussion topic is race, caste, and poverty. Allow me to welcome Professor Eleanor Mary Brown. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you very much for having me. I
Greetings
am
from
delighted to be here.
greetings from India. Allow me to
Greetings,
introduce.
greetings, greetings from the United States. Greetings from my native Jamaica. I am very delighted to be here. Thank you for having me.
Allow me to introduce her as one of the leading scholars on the subject matter of race, equality, and justice, who with her scholarship has impacted the lives of millions. She is one of the leading experts who possesses her qualification from topmost universities of the world, including JD from Yale Law School, MPhil from University of Oxford, and she has been She has been the Reginald F. Lewis Fellow at Harvard Law School from year 2007 to 2009. Currently, she is the professor of law and international affairs at Penn State University, Pennsylvania. She is also one of the senior scientists with Rock Ethics Institute at Penn State University, besides recipient of Rhodes Scholarship in her early academic years. So, let me take this privilege to welcome Professor Eleanor Mary Brown once more for our discussion on the subject matter of race, caste, and poverty, which is the concern of millions of citizens, at least in India and US, across the globe. We find this the problem of race, equality, and justice. So, welcome, Professor, once again.
Thank you very much. You're very kind in your introduction. I would not describe myself as a leading expert, but it is very kind of you to say so. Thank you very much.
Well, Professor, this is not me who is saying so. This is your work which is speaking volumes about it. So
Thank you very much.
what I'm saying is all about your work and the pioneer work which you have done over the last 25 years or more than that. So based on that, Professor, we have very carefully chosen the subject matter of today's discussion, that is race, caste, and poverty. Poverty as a global phenomena, race a very typical to the US and the American society, and the caste as a very specific social problem with the Indian society. So, our questions and discussions are going to be confined on the social, economic, and political construct of these two themes along with poverty, that is, race, caste, and poverty. My first question to you: how do you see yourself as a black professor pioneering the very critical race theory in United States?
So your question is specifically about critical race theory.
Critical race theory.
Okay, so let me begin by saying that I teach in this area. I have written in this area in the past. I have not written in this area recently, but I have many colleagues who have, and I, of course, have been following the public discussion. Let me further say that I think the current public discussion of critical race theory in the United States and more broadly in the American media is not an accurate reflection of the scholarship. And I think it is important to say that. Let me first, I also want to note that the real the evolution of critical race theory came from a recognition that traditional American institutions, and particularly legal institutions, were leading to deeply unequal results, in which particular historically disenfranchised populations, African Americans, Latinx Americans, Native Americans, and later on the conversation has broadened to include other disenfranchised groups of people like LGBTQ plus Americans. Recognizing that there were clear disparities in several aspects of the law, in the criminal justice system, in employment, in property, large aspects of the law, scholars began to think about how it is that institutions that appear to be equal and appear to be equally administering justice lead to such profoundly unequal results. So why, for example, do we have disproportionate numbers of African American men being arrested? Not just African American men, African American women, Hispanic American men, Latino, Latinx Americans. Why are they disproportionately likely to be convicted, to be indicted? And if you look at that question, you begin to see that. I'm going to give you an example. When the United States Congress passed a few decades ago legislation regulating crack cocaine versus regular cocaine, although both were narcotics, although both had negative effects on communities, the sentences that were attached to one class of drugs were much, much more onerous than the sentences that were attached to another class of drugs. One class of drugs were utilized more by white Americans. Those had shorter sentences. The class of drugs that were utilized more by African Americans had longer sentences. So when you look at the statute books, it is not immediately obvious to you what has occurred, but in the way that knowing that the populations utilized the drug differently, you recognize that it is going to be a problem if the laws are applied in disparate ways, in different ways. And that is precisely what occurred. And part of what has happened is that you have seen an extraordinary ballooning of the population of incarcerated people. And on top of that, you have seen disproportionately Black and brown persons and Black and brown men being arrested, indicted, prosecuted, and jailed for much longer sentences. Critical race theory asks, why is that happening? What is it about the way that we have conceptualized the criminal justice system and the way that we administer the laws that allows this to happen? There are many other areas of the law in which similar questions are asked. So, for example, with respect to the foster care system, the system in which when parents may be having difficulties, the state steps in and, essentially takes on a role of finding a substitute family while the parents are having difficulties. African American children are far more likely to end up in that foster care system. So they ask questions, why it is that Black parents and Black mothers in particular are more likely to be perceived as not being good parents? Why are they more likely to be taken from their parents' homes? Why are the children less likely to be placed in stable circumstances? So there are many, I just give you two examples there.
Yes.
But there are many areas of the law. And then I want to point out that that has led to a number of other critical theories. I don't mean to misspeak. These critical theories have developed alongside critical race theory. So feminist legal theories, particularly concerned with gender. There are critical theories, particularly concerned with members of the LGBTQ plus community. And what has happened now, I think, and I think it's important to say this, as I said at the beginning, is that recognizing that many people in the American public have not previously had exposure to critical race theory, because it is taught at the university level, and even more specifically, it is taught at law schools. So this is not something that is taught in regular elementary or middle or high school. It is not taught between grade 1 and grade 12. It is a postgraduate course of study, particularly in law schools. And recognizing that many Americans are very uncomfortable with discussions of race. Political actors have very deliberately put the terminology into the public domain in a way that they know it is going to be misunderstood, so that they can weaponize the terminology and make it become an issue that is relevant in political campaigns in a way that it should not be. Which is not to say that critical race theory doesn't belong in the public discourse. It is to say that if it is in the public discourse, it is important to deal with it in a responsible manner, and that has not been done. I hope I've answered your question.
Yes, Professor. And on a very similar note, even from my experience as a practitioner before the constitutional courts in India, particularly when it comes to the criminal conviction, there are certain states in India which mandates to write down the caste of the accused person. And based on the caste, revealing the moment you reveal the caste and it gets revealed, I feel that the quantum of sentences and punishment also gets dependent on that. Whether one belongs to the depressed class or the marginalized class of the Indian society, then he or she will be punished for a quite longer sentences, and the harsher punishment will be inflicted by the courts. So this discrimination gets structured in the very system of justice. And though we do not have a critical caste theory here, but yes, taking a clue from critical race theories and the questioning from the very same standpoint, I also question the very deliverables of just judicial system in Indian context, that it gets discriminatory when it comes to the providing justice to the in Indian setup.
Yes,
Now,
I understand what you're saying. Now, let me tell you what we have in common here, and which is what I hope we discuss. The systems were originally set up clearly with the goals of treating different types of people differently. And when I say different types of people differently, I am acknowledging that race is a social construction, caste is a social construction, but social constructions that existed for particular reasons. So in my area of the world, which I know best, which is the Caribbean, many Indians will know the Caribbean because, like Indians, we play very good cricket. Not as good as India recently, but so that's a region of the world I'm from, the West Indies. Yeah. We have a similar background to India in that we're part of the British Commonwealth. That happened because we were British colonized. A major motivation for the colonization of the West Indies was we were very efficient producers of sugar. Sugar was a valuable global commodity. Much of it was produced in West Indian sugar plantations. The West Indies has good soil, good climate, but you need a labor force. The labor force was brought from West Africa primarily. And so this was an enterprise which made persons in the British Empire, and particularly in the metropole, in places like London and Manchester and Liverpool and Bristol, very, very rich. Now, if you are calling a class of human beings slaves, people who are enslaved, and they are working as property, because they're considered property no different than, you know, a cow or a goat, or a horse, and they are making you very rich. They're uncompensated free labor. And by free labor, I mean uncompensated labor. You need to tell a narrative about why that is justifiable. And the way you tell that narrative is you say these people are different, they are lower, they are inferior, because that's what you need to do to justify building an economic base on enslaving people. And so the judicial system was conceptualized and enforced in the context of plantation slavery. If you later have abolition, emancipation, slavery is abolished, and you do not reform that system, although you may later labor under the illusion that the system can administer justice equally, often you will find it cannot, because it was never designed in the first place to do so. It was designed for a system of deep inequality, which was part of how sugar was produced and which was part of what contributed to the wealth of the British Empire, right? The West Indian colonies were worth more to the British Empire, one colony in particular, Jamaica, where I was from, than all of the American colonies, the 13 American colonies, that became the United States of America. And that was because of the wealth that was being generated by enslaved people in sugar. So my point is, in all of these systems, in India, it might be caste. In my region of the world, it might be race. I could tell a similar narrative, although there are important differences about the United States South in particular, and the production of cotton and slavery, in the importance of slavery in the production of cotton, which was also a very valuable commodity. But the fundamental point is you have these systems producing great wealth. You have a set of people who have been profoundly marginalized and discriminated against, and who are doing the work to produce the wealth. And you need to tell narratives about why it is justifiable to oppress them. And you need to create systems that help oppress them, part of that system being the police force, in the criminal justice system. And when the system continues to do today, perhaps in less pernicious ways, but nevertheless continues to do deeply unequal things today, you cannot proclaim yourself surprised, because that was what it was designed to do in the first place. That's my point.
So basically the crux of the discussion so far is the race and caste is a construct of social, political, and economic aspects of the given society, where the ruling class continues to justify and treat or discriminate a particular section of society, so-called marginalized section of society, to maintain their and build their economic empire.
That is correct. That is what I'm saying. And what I am saying is, when the economic systems are modified, so you have emancipation, you have the abolition of slavery, but you had built a set of institutions that were integral to maintaining the oppression of a whole group of people, because you needed them to be the workers in an economic system. And so the systems were designed to do that. So you cannot later say that you are support. Now, if you are going to have those systems continue to administer criminal justice, you have got to do very specific and proactive things to make sure that those systems are in fact administering justice in an equal way. If you don't do that, you're going to end up with permutations of what happened before, less pernicious, but nevertheless deeply unjust. And that is how you end up with a system in which George Floyd, who I'm sure,
Yes,
is a globally known figure for very tragic reasons. He was killed in broad daylight,
by the
essentially, exactly, by a policeman. That is the result of a criminal justice system which has told that policeman that there will be no consequences for killing George Floyd in broad daylight. So that is the point that I'm making.
Yes. So do you believe? Do you also believe that the very structure of political power has to be reweaved to give a sense of dignity, dignified and meaningful justice to the so-called marginalized section of society on account of race and caste?
Okay, so the first thing I want to say is that it is very important for people who have historically been marginalized to be political decision makers. That's extremely important. When you make transitions to constitutional democracies, and India would be the largest such entity in the world, the foundation of that system is democracy, and the foundational decision makers are people who vote for legislation. So the most important thing is that those decision makers include in a robust and substantive way members of the groups who have historically been marginalized. They need to be present when you're writing the Constitution, and they need to be present when you're voting on laws, and they need to be present when laws are being administered. That's the first thing. But having them represented is not good enough. You need to explicitly acknowledge the ways that have been historically discriminated against. And then you need to put in safeguards to make sure that that doesn't happen in the future. And if you're not clear and intentional in doing so, and if you're not vigilant to make sure that the safeguards are applied and enforced, what you will get is a continuation of what was happening before.
So it is also equally important that the leaders who are getting the responsibility to represent the marginalized class on account of race and caste in the legislature, they have to be very vigilant and watchful to at least make a point that they have been historically marginalized and the injustices has happened and their rights needs to be protected. They
That
have
is
to.
correct. That is correct. And I would say more. I would say you have to audit. And by audit, I mean you need to repeatedly check again and again and again and again. Are there disparities? Why are the disparities happening? And what you will find is that even when you control for other factors like socioeconomic class and poverty, even when you control for those factors, you will find that the disparities are maintaining themselves. And so you need to be vigilant. You cannot just pass the laws. You need an ongoing mechanism of holding people accountable. Now, to do that, the persons in the legislature have to be held accountable. So you need to be robust in making sure that people who have historically been disenfranchised. The term that I utilize is people from castes who have historically been disenfranchised, who have historically been discriminated against. They need to have access to the polls. They need to be able to vote. It's very important because they have to hold their legislators accountable, and they can only do that if they're at the polling booth. So they need to be able to vote, and in holding their legislators accountable, the legislators will then hold the persons who are administering justice accountable. But without the democratic element, it doesn't work. It's very important that people who have historically been discriminated against have a set of robust voting rights.
So the very point which you are making is that the merely having a constitutional democracy and a voting right will not affect the effective change or will not bring the effective change in the given setup. Your legislator, so-called elected legislator or the representative, have to be very vigilant to make sure that your rights gets protected. And let me share a very experience from India, that the representatives from marginalized section of society gets elected once in a 5 year, and then they forget.
Yes, but you see, this is important. What will prevent them from forgetting is holding them accountable at the polls. So it
Yeah.
has to be a situation in which they don't have guaranteed jobs. It has to be a situation in which when they go back to the polls, they explain to their constituents, this is what I have done to make sure you're not discriminated against. And if they can't give that explanation, they need to be voted out. It's very important.
So, Professor, do you think that it's because what I am seeing here in the practical ground realities in Indian context, that because of illiteracy and poverty, where common man is busy with his or her daily needs, that how to secure the foods 3 times in a day, and how to bring the childrens and how to provide them a better education, they do not have this the system. We here in India do not have this system of auditing or even the putting up the questions to the when they comes for seeking vote. So what specific recommendations you would recommend, how this Indian typical Indian society will grow, and at what to me it seems that they're going through this way, the justice will be a quite distant mirage only.
Okay, so let me say this. The first thing I want to say is there are, so recently in the media, one of the things I loved about going to graduate school at Oxford is you had people from all over the world, Indians, Nigerians, Jamaicans, and so you become very interested in global politics. So I listen to the India BBC feed. I read Indian newspapers when I can. And what I've been very struck by is recently there has been this very large demonstration of Indian farmers. Very, very large.
Yeah.
And because of the large demonstration of these Indian farmers, they were able to exercise enough political power that they were able to get the Modi administration to repeal some very unpopular farming laws, regulations. Now, irrespective of what you think of the farming regulations, irrespective of that issue, which I do not have the background to be able to evaluate, what is very interesting to me is that these are poor farmers. They are marginalized people. They're disproportionately likely to come from castes that have historically been marginalized.
Yes.
And they were able to organize a political movement. So what we need to think about is what are the ways in which you can create structures that allow those types of political movements to occur. That is the question that needs to be asked. Because you have seen evidence of it very recently in India. That's a very robust democratic response. This is one of the largest democratic responses that the world has ever seen. And it happened very recently. So the question I would ask is, how were those Indian farmers organized? How were they organized? How did they take to the streets? How did they get their voices heard? Whatever was done there is what needs to be done more broadly, because they're marginalized, they're undercapitalized, their farms are poor, they do not have a lot of cash, and they still took to the streets. That's the point I'm making.
So, Professor, again, coming to this farmer agitation and the lesson which we learn from this farmer agitation, particularly in context of the marginalized section of people and their voices being heard by the so-called legislators or the people or the elected representatives who are in the power. What happened in the exactly 1 year ago, the Indian Parliament, because the Modi government has the number to pass the legislation, they passed the legislation without discussion, without evaluating its impact on the so-called farmers and the marginalized, large section of marginalized farmers, that how they will survive and how they will, because it was almost giving away the farming sector to the corporates and the
Yes, I
corporate.
understand. I understand. Right, and it was just to be more precise. Even if you believe that the sector needs to be liberalized, you have to give You have to put a social welfare cushion such that you give the farmers some guarantee that if there is a significant diminution in their quality of life, in their access to earnings, the government is going to step in and subsidize them. You can't do what the government just tried to do without giving the farmers some assurances that they will have some income, their children will be educated, they'll be able to feed their families, and that's why it's so powerful, because it's saying to the government, you cannot do this without telling us what you're going to do to provide some assurances to us in the future. That's very, very powerful. And what it is saying is, in the distribution of goods by the Indian state, we need to be taken care of. It is saying there are structural inequalities. We have historically not been taken care of. Other interests have been taken care of, and we need to be taken care of. That's what it's saying. That's what the demonstration was saying. That's very, very impressive.
Precisely, all kind of hate propagandas and the manner in which throughout the years the ruling political party has discredited this farmers agitation in India, and they have branded them anti-nationals, they have branded them goons, they have branded them sponsoring the terrorism across the group and from the foreign jurisdictions, that the no farm, and they have come to the mainstream media and says even on the floor of the parliament that these farmers are not the real farmers, rather than they are have been sponsored farmers, they are the one who are the support, who are being sponsored by the terrorist from the different parts of the globes to destabilize the typical Indian society. However, it was the will of these farmers who sat across the globe, not the globe, for full complete 1 year, and still they are sitting on the streets and the roads leading to Delhi, the capital city of India, with their demands that you give us the protection of minimum price guarantee, that is
Yes,
minimum
yes,
price guarantee
yes,
for their products. So
yes,
because the repealing, their demand was not only the repeal of the three controversial laws, rather than they are securing a minimum price guarantee for their produce and for their crops as well.
yes. And
So
what I am saying is, it is not credible. I am not competent as to the specific politics because I'm not there. But I'm saying it is not credible for millions of people to come out and say, we need a minimum price guarantee for our crops, and then to write these people off as being agitators with foreign backing. You can't do that, right? And that's why it is so impressive. What I'm saying, it is a extraordinary demonstration of the fact that poor people, poor marginalized people, and I'm a property scholar, so I'm particularly impressed that they're farmers because they're small property holders, and they have utilized their collective power to say this cannot happen without our input. And irrespective of what you think of the substantive policy, irrespective of whether or not they're members of the coalition who may be distasteful, none of which I know because I'm not there, I am saying that it is impressive. And I'm saying whatever structures allow those farmers to organize like that is what you need more broadly. That is what I'm saying. Because those farmers, they're poor, they are trying to find 3 meals a day for their family. They don't have any time to be organizing. They're trying to feed their families. They're trying to educate their children. So whatever process got them on the streets to demonstrate, those are the structures that are needed. Politicians can be held accountable. That's what I'm saying.
yes, and you use the expression collective power. So, in Indian context, I would like to bring forth a point here. The population of scheduled caste, scheduled tribes, and the OBC, other backward class, so-called backward class. If we take the umbrella expression, backward class in India is more than 80% or 85% of the Indian population.
Yes,
Still, they
and
are.
I understand. Let me just say, I understand the utilization of the word. I discuss it a lot with Indian friends. Because in the West, in our part of the world, the phrase backward sounds discriminatory. So instead of using the term backward, although I recognize that that is a term that is utilized and I'm acknowledging it, I like to say castes that have historically been excluded and historically discriminated against. I'm just explaining why I utilize the terminology that I utilize.
So, taking a clue from your point, I will also start using the caste which has been historically discriminated.
Exactly.
They constitute more than 85% of the Indian population, and still not able to organize, despite their uh, increase in their education level, despite their a minimal increase in their economic power. Still they are not able to organize and capture the political power. Capture the political power in the sense that still they are underrepresented when it comes to the representation in respective legislatures and respective parliament in Indian context. So, do you see how do you see the role of education and the political awakening, particularly awakening towards their rights in Indian context? It is whether it is important to have the real sense of constitutional democracy, where the real people gets a chance to share the power, political power.
Okay, so let me begin by saying that I believe in a state that provides a buffer for its citizens, particularly its most marginalized citizens, so that they are not living in poverty. That's the first thing that I need to see. So for me, the ideal model is a Scandinavian model. By that I mean a Finland, a Sweden, a Denmark, where the state has decided for our citizens to be fully participating citizens. Their basic needs need to be taken care of. We need to be sure that they're properly fed, they're properly housed, their children are properly educated. That is where I think any post-colonial constitutional democracy, like my own Jamaica or yours, India, needs to be heading. If you put a cushion the under your poorest and most marginalized citizens, you make it such that they know where their 3 meals a day are coming from, they have a house over their heads, and they can educate their children. You then put them in a situation in which they are far better equipped to be robust contributors to a democracy. That's the first thing. So that's where everybody should be trying to get. However, as is the case with many countries that have achieved independence relatively recently, many countries have not yet developed the resources or the administrative structure to allow them to do that. So the question becomes, in the interim, what happens? And my focus really would be, and this reflects my strong belief, based also in a lot of academic support, that you need to focus on the women and the children. Amartya Sen, the extraordinary Nobel winning scholar,
Yes.
also an Indian national, has written a lot about this. If women are empowered and women continue to be the primary caregivers of children, there is no better way to get resources to children. And women who are empowered and are concerned about the long-term opportunity sets of their children are very, very powerful political actors. So to the extent that there are persons trying to support the development of robust democratic participation among disenfranchised Indians, poor Indians. And those persons are getting support from NGOs, from international funding agencies, etc. I would say your focus needs to be on the democratic participation of Indian women. That's where I would start.
Yeah,
With the
precise.
woman, you get the children. And it's very clear the spin-off economic and developmental benefits of focusing on women who have historically been terribly discriminated against if you look at Sen's work.
Professor, one of the question which is actually in my mind, which I wanted to ask you, which I want to ask you, and particularly your take on the idea of merit, because here in India, we the from the who belongs to the socially and the marginalized section of the society, like the caste which has been discriminated historically, they say that they are not meritorious. Similar is the situation in the American setup or the West, that the black people are not meritorious. So do you all how do you see this very, and they say that the any affirmative action in favor of so-called marginalized section or the historically depressed class of citizens or the historically who have been discriminated, like Indian constitution provides for the reservation in education for the scheduled caste and scheduled tribes, reservation in public employment in favor of scheduled caste and scheduled tribes and the others historically discriminated castes. So they said the so-called privileged class or the upper class says that it compromises the merit. How do you construct the very idea of merit? Is it the merit, is some merit something which is the monopoly of privileged group or privileged class?
Okay, so let me begin by saying this. Okay, so the notion of merit is meant to reflect the idea that for particular jobs, particular university slots, particular scarce goods, whatever those scarce goods are, whether they're jobs, university slots, etc., people need to have particular skills to demonstrate that they are worthy of those scarce goods. That's essentially what merit is about. Now, as an abstract concept, that appears to be reasonable as an abstract concept. The difficulty is that if you have had historical structures of discrimination which have denied particular people access to the resources that they would need to prepare themselves with the skills for those slots, you are in essence continuing to subsidize elites who have traditionally had access when non-elites have not. And you are subsidizing elite access to those jobs and university slots. So for example, there has recently been a study in the United States with respect to Harvard University. This paper came out very recently. An analysis was done of students who have benefited from preferences for children of legacies. Legacies are, so if you went to Harvard University before, there is a preference given to your child.
Yes.
There are also preferences for athletes, particular athletes for particular sports. There are also preferences for children of Harvard faculty. Now, when they did the analysis, it was clear that those people had a much easier chance of getting into Harvard than the people who did not have those preferences. And it was also clear that those people were disproportionately likely to be white, as opposed to African American, Hispanic American, Native American, and disproportionately likely to be rich. So what I am saying is these preferences have existed for years, for decades, for longer than that. Nobody has ever deconstructed it. We called it merit. We said these people were at Harvard because they're deserving, because they're bright, because they're skilled, and we called it merit. It was not merit.
Yes.
It was that they had historically been beneficiaries of access to privileged education systems, privileged schools, privileged neighborhoods. In the United States, schools tend to be tied to property taxes. Property taxes, of course, are tied to how fancy your house is. Are you rich enough to live in a particular neighborhood? And so this is why I think we have to look very critically at this conception of merit, because it becomes a mechanism of justifying privileged elites continuing to get privilege. Now, having said that, to the extent that you have preferences for people who have historically not been privileged, I think what you need to do is you need to have some sense of what are your goals. At what point will I have some comfort level that historical structures to which African Americans didn't have access, Hispanic Americans, Native Americans, LGBTQ plus Americans, women, at what point am I satisfied that I am seeing sufficient progress in their levels of employment, their levels of access to decent housing, their levels of access to university slots? I mention university slots, because I'm a university professor, so I think about that a lot. And you got to be conscious about it. You got to be conscious about what would constitute a level of progress which is indicative that you have made a dent in historical discrimination. If you're not conscious about it, what you will find is you'll go decades and centuries without making the progress that you had anticipated. And then you will at that point find yourself saying, I have to continue the preferences. I have no choice, but because we haven't made the progress. You have to be very explicit and deliberate about making the progress. You need to say who's going to what schools. Are those schools properly funded? Are the teachers properly paid? Have they, you understand the point I'm making? So
Yes.
so it's important to have a constitutional framework. For example, what you referred to in the Indian Constitution, the preferences with respect to government jobs, etc. But it is as important to have an administrative structure that is auditing and making sure that persons are getting access to the resources they should be getting access to. Because if you do not do that, the preference system is not going to get you to the goal of what you want to get to. So I would ask questions about the state, about the administration, about are the children getting access to proper education? And if they're not, why not? Have we made the progress in the last few decades that we should have made? Those are the questions that need to be asked.
Exactly, Professor. From the Indian point of view, I would like to inform you that it is written in the Constitution. It is time and being amended also to give a sense of justice to the historically oppressed class or historically discriminated class of citizens or the caste of citizens in India. However, when it comes to the administration, that is the executives, in implementing them in ground, then it becomes the zero. They, in one or other pretext, with the help of judicial institutions, to that extent, I will say that with the help of judicial institutions, including Supreme Court of India, they go on to obstruct and the implementation of real affirmative programs or the scheme of reservations in favor of marginalized section of society or the scheduled caste or scheduled tribes in Indian context. As for example, I will give, in year 2006, there was a judgment from the Supreme Court of India that the constitutional amendments which were made in favor of scheduled caste and scheduled tribes with respect to the reservation in promotion and the promotional avenue, so that the persons belonging to the marginalized section also reach to the top of the post in the administrative services. That has been upheld and that has been declared constitutional. Still, it is 2021. Almost 15 years has lapsed. It has not been implemented in ground realities. The
Yes,
state.
I get your point, and that's what I'm saying is the problem. That's what I'm saying is the problem. So you're understanding precisely what I'm saying. And so, for example, I have always wondered. A very famous institution on this side of the world is IIT. These famous Indian computer science institutions.
Yes.
No, I would be very interested because these institutions have become gateways to tremendous privilege. People get visas, they get to go work for Microsoft and Google and all of these very fancy companies. They're able to build wealth. It's not coincidental that when you look at the head of Microsoft, the head of Twitter, the head of Google, they're Indian trained engineers. I would be very interested and this is Indian trained engineers built. These are institutions built and subsidized by the Indian state. Okay. I would be very interested. Are members of the historically discriminated caste, are they getting access to these institutions? Are they getting access to these? That is a question I'm very interested in. You see, because that is going to tell you a lot. Who is going to IIT? Who's getting admission? Who's graduating? I'm very interested in that.
For your kind information, I will like to inform that the previous government, particularly in year 2009 and 2010, they wanted to restrict the very access, saying that these institutions are of institution of national importance and excellence. Henceforth, we will not implement the reservation, or we will not even provide a scheme for access to by the students who belongs to the marginalized section or the historically oppressed caste and class of the Indian society. However, that amendment was not given effect. But in practical realities, what is happening, that whenever a student or whatsoever the limited number of students who from the so-called historically oppressed class of the society or the caste of the Indian society are getting into these IITs, they are being deliberately failed on one or other pretext, stating and giving the reason that the child is not able to cope up with this level of studies, and he has come with a sense, he has got admission into this institution with reservation or with through the affirmative actions program.
And what I would say in response to that, of course, I'm not there, so I can't verify. But what I would say in response to that is that it reflects the fact that there has not been sufficient investment at a primary and secondary level in education. So if that is in fact happening, and it would mean that the Indian government hasn't invested in the pipeline, in the educational at the primary, the pre-primary, the primary, and the secondary level, to make it such that they have a robust group of people who can go to IIT and do well. So that's not a reflection on the students. That's a reflection on the level of education they had access to before they got to IIT. So we are in agreement on that. I am conscious of time, so I want to be sure that if you have any other questions, you have an opportunity to ask me them.
Here again, I will like to interject for a few seconds. That for last 2 years, 2020, since the beginning of 2020, we are seeing this coronavirus and the spread of pandemic and everything coming down, like closer, getting. India is such a populous country, more than 135 crore population, but the educational institutions are yet to open and commence the physical classes and the resume classes. The schools are yet to open, and it is the last institution of the government which is opening up or which is planning to open up in physical classes. Otherwise, for last 2 years, the education has not been the prime agenda. Every business, every organization, every institution in this country is running and functioning for last under this, but not the educational institution. Schools are shut down and continue to shut down, and the schools say they justify that because of the government policy we are not able to likely to open it up, and we are facilitating through technology and the online classes. But schools and the government forgets that the here majority of the population could not afford a smartphone or the online classes.
Yes,
And
I understand. Yes, yes. So let me say this to you. We're having the same challenge in the Caribbean generally and particularly in Jamaica. We are just beginning to open up. The government is just beginning to authorize people to go back to schools in my native Jamaica. The problem is, for what has essentially been 2 years, because March will be 2 years, you have a whole group of children without resources to access high-speed internet, without resources to access a smartphone, without resources to access a tablet, without supervision, because it's not just that they don't have the resources to access the tablet and the smartphone. It's that their parents do not have the resources to sit down beside them and make sure that they sit down in the classes, because if they're minors, they need to be supervised. And so they have essentially lost 2 years of schooling. They have lost 2 years of schooling. Now, it seems to me that you cannot ignore that and pretend that they have been in school for 2 years, because they have not, right? It seems to me that what you need to do is you need to assess and you need to start them where they left off. A lot of governments do not want to do this because they are terrified of the political consequences of saying to parents, your child was in, grade 5 or standard 5, whatever you may call it, and they should be in grade 7 or standard 7, but they haven't done much academic work for the last 2 years. They're in grade 5. You gotta acknowledge it and meet the children where they are. So that's what I'm saying to you. Because if you don't do that, you're going to end up reinforcing the discrimination and that we have just discussed. You're going to hear they can't get in, they're not bright, they're not meritorious. That's what you're going to hear. When the issue was they haven't been educated for the last 2 years. So we are in agreement. I very much enjoyed talking to you. I wanted to be polite. I didn't want in any way to end, but I just wanted to be sure if you had any other questions, you had the opportunity to ask me.
Professor, my questions would list of questions are quite long, but we are bound by the time, and it was indeed absolutely a pleasure to talk to you on different aspects and dimensions of race, caste, and poverty this evening. We had a discussion.
And I want to say to you, in the future, if you would like for me to come back, I would be delighted to. This has been a wonderful conversation, Mr. Prakash, and I would very much enjoy coming back.
Professor, let me sum up. Let me sum up by saying this, that we had a very meaningful discussion right from the beginning with critical race theory, its evaluation, and how the world and scholars perceive it, where is the gap, what we need to discuss about, what we need to be more participative in the democratic process, and what the role of race, historically oppressed race or the class of citizens or the caste of citizens have to play, the importance of education, the affirmative actions programs, and the access to the opportunities, and how with the prime example of how the Harvard Law Schools continues to subsidize the opportunity in favor of a privileged group of citizens, sections of the society, simultaneously comparing it with the so-called Indian Institute of Technology, IITs, of whose alumni heads the global companies like Microsoft, Twitter, and all those. Even the Google, Alphabet is being headed by an IIT alumni from India. So while I was browsing to my viewers and listeners, I would like to again give a piece of information that Professor Brown had written in 1995 an article. Its title is The Tower of Babel, Bridging the Divide Between Critical Race Theory and Mainstream Civil Rights Scholarship. I am very much impressed and influenced by this piece of your write-up, which you wrote in 1995.
Yes,
way
that's
back
a
in the,
long time ago. I was
if
still in law school. Yes, yes, that's a long time ago.
and I would like to conclude this session, this very meaningful and wonderful conversation with you, with the very first sentence of your this paper, that poor black people tell stories. Here
Ah,
I
yes,
will
yes,
say, here I
yes.
will say,
And part of the point of critical race theory is to validate their stories. Is to, and when I say validate, I don't mean clearly the stories have value. I mean to tell the stories so that they get to broader audiences and they're no longer marginalized stories.
and
And
today's
I also wanted to say one other thing. I also wanted to say that I mentioned gender a lot, the importance of the inclusion of Indian women and children. And I also wanted to say, when I mentioned Harvard, I was talking about Harvard University more generally, not the law school. And Harvard is indicative of a broader problem. They have the data set at Harvard, so they have been able to publish the paper. But if you did several other universities, you would find the same problem. That's what I'm saying.
and today's story and discussion was all about that the historically oppressed class of citizens also have a story to tell, and the
Exactly.
world needs to listen to us and provide a sense of justice the and in response to the historical injustices which have been met to us. Thank you,
And
Professor.
I would end by saying, you said poor black people tell stories. I would end by saying poor Indian people tell stories, and we must amplify their story.
Thank you. It was indeed a pleasure talking to you. Goodbye. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Thank you. It was a delight. Delighted to be here. All the best. Bye bye.
Bye bye.